After finishing my shower, I realized I didn't have a towel. I leaned halfway out to call my best friend, only to come face to face with a stranger. Oh, never mind, it was my ex. Just as I was about to call out, he shoved a towel into my arms and said, "Why call? Is there anything I haven't seen before?" Dressed and ready, we sat in the living room, staring at each other. "How did you get in?" I asked. "If you tell me the truth now, I might choose not to call the police, considering our past." Rocky looked helpless. "Serena is my sister." "Oh, well, I had always known Serena had a brother, but I didn't realize it was him." "Why are you in New York?" After asking, I wanted to bite my tongue. Didn't that make me seem like I cared too much about my ex's life? At the city hospital for a month-long exchange. City hospital, I suddenly thought of something and smirked. Alice is at the city hospital. How nice. Rocky frowned. Since we broke up, I haven't dated anyone. He paused. Serena mentioned a friend getting married. That would be you, right? Since he had guessed it already, I didn't hide it anymore. Yes, we plan to get engaged after the new year when we meet the parents. Congratulations, he said briefly. Soon Serena came back, surprised to see us together, and insisted we go out for a meal. After sending Rocky off, it was already evening. After washing up, I was ready for bed when Serena opened my door and crawled into my bed. I smiled helplessly and lay down beside her. "Did you and my brother have something going on?" Serena looked at me with bright, inquisitive eyes, the flames of gossip burning brightly. "Did you date?" This brother and sister duo, always straight to the point. Yes, I thought for a moment we were high school classmates and broke up after college graduation. Why? She was anxious, sitting up so quickly that the blanket slid off her. Because he studied abroad for 2 years, and we couldn't handle the long-distance relationship. I was actually lying. I was the one who proposed the breakup because of Alice. What a pity. Serena lay back down and said, "My parents were always on border research missions, so I was brought along." Rocky stayed with his grandparents. Later, Rocky was excited to tell me he had a super girlfriend and was going to introduce her to me, but before he could, they broke up. Realizing it was pointless to say more, she stuck out her tongue. "Let's not talk about my brother. Are you going out with Tony tomorrow?" "Yes, Tony invited me to celebrate New Year's together." I smiled. "When will you find someone?" Tony was also my high school classmate. After breaking up with Rocky, Tony set up a blind date with me, pursued me for a long time, and then we got together. Unlike Rocky, Tony is almost a social butterfly, with a personality akin to a socialite. I used to dislike Tony's overly familiar nature, but he was sweet-talking, considerate, and really cared for me, so I accepted him. I arrived at the mall a bit early, intending to surprise him, but saw a girl holding Tony's sleeve, not letting him go. I was quite puzzled but didn't approach rashly and hid in a nearby concealed spot. "Tony," the girl's voice was tearful, "you promised to watch a movie with me." "But baby," Tony coaxed, "I have an urgent matter at the company right now. How about next time? I'll spend a whole day with you then." Unable to hold back any longer, I clicked my high heels and rushed out. "Who is this?" I looked at him with cold eyes. I haven't seen her before. He hadn't expected me to appear at this moment. He quickly shifted from panic to calmness. "This is my cousin," I sneered. "How shameless of you." Tony was flustered and pushed me. "What do you mean?" But that push made me lose my balance, and I fell to the ground, hitting the edge of a counter. People gathered around us. I forced myself to stand up, enduring the sharp pain in my ankle, and walked up to the stunned Tony, giving him a hard slap. "Scumbag." After saying that, I turned and walked away alone. Because of the sprain, I took off my high heels and carried them in my hand. The ground was cold, and with every step I couldn't help but shiver. The cold wind was biting, painfully stinging my forehead. I couldn't help but laugh, not at anything else, just at myself. Until this morning, I still thought what I had was love. When taking a taxi, the driver looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost, hesitated for a moment, and asked, "Miss, are you okay? Your face is covered in blood." Hearing this, I looked up into the rearview mirror. Dark red blood had dried, and fresh red blood was slowly trickling from a cut on my forehead, probably from hitting the counter earlier. I sighed. "Driver, please take me to the hospital." By the time I got to the hospital, it was very late. Serena was working late and on her way. She was furious after hearing about Tony's actions and cursed him out for a long time. It's strange. Am I emotionally dead? I no longer felt the anger I once had. Holding my high heels and with a bloody face, I walked into the emergency room. A group of people was coming towards me, including Rocky and Alice. Alice saw me first, but quickly looked away, pretending to laugh with those around her. "Damn, how unlucky." I was about to take another route when Rocky spotted me, said something to the people around him, and hurried over. "What happened to you?" Rocky bent down slightly. "How did you get such a big cut on your forehead?" As he spoke, his gaze moved downward, noticing my swollen ankle wrapped in stockings. "Who did you fight with?" I gave him a blank look. Can you not talk? He became serious. Let's go. I'll take care of your wounds, he said, taking big steps forward, his coat flapping. Before I could ask him to slow down, he stopped and quickly walked back to my side. I'll carry you, he said. Since your ankle is sprained and you're not wearing shoes, it'll be faster if I carry you. He squatted down to meet my eyes. And I know you broke up. I'm not going to steal someone else's partner. His words seemed disjointed, which made me laugh. Seeing that I didn't object, he picked me up. The harsh lighting in the hospital was glaring, but Rocky's chiseled face remained unchanged. When I looked up at him, I noticed his slightly flushed ears. There were few people at the payment counter. The sleepy cashier immediately woke up upon seeing us. Emergency room, Rocky stopped and said, "Thank you." He suddenly added, "This is my girlfriend." The cashier's confusion was almost visible on her face, but she still politely processed the payment for us. "I don't think I'm your girlfriend yet." I stretched out the last word. "Mr. Rocky." He stared straight ahead. "I'm using you as a shield so that no one gets any wrong ideas about me." "Sorry." "How does Dr. Alice feel about this?" I didn't realize how bitter my question sounded. "Isn't it a problem?" Rocky laid me on the bed. "Are you jealous?" I looked at him, suddenly feeling choked up and speechless. He smiled at me, taking me back to our high school days. I wasn't doing well academically, so the teacher assigned me to sit next to him for help. Math was like astronomy to me. I didn't understand it and would embarrassingly ask him about the problems on my paper. He was playing a game and glanced at me but didn't respond. I was embarrassed and a bit angry, sullenly taking back my paper and staring at it. "Okay," the math teacher clapped the podium. "Everyone, report the problems you don't understand." Before I could react, Rocky snatched the paper from my desk and loudly announced, "Question 2, for 8, 11. He continued, frowning as he went from question 11 to 16. "Don't you know these?" The math teacher frowned. "Aren't you getting full marks?" He leaned back with a smile. "I don't know. What have you helped me with?" I was somewhat embarrassed. "If I didn't ask, would you have the courage to?" He shook his game console and smiled freely. "I've finished, and I'll explain the answers to the remaining questions to you later." Serena arrived and brought me a pair of shoes, my big, fluffy slippers. She seemed to anticipate I'd be picky, frowning and pretending to be serious. "Haley, put these on." Looking up, she noticed my newly stitched wound and couldn't help but curse Tony as a scumbag. "Tony?" Rocky frowned. "Did he do this?" "I didn't tell you?" Serena got agitated. "He was caught cheating by Haley," panicked, and pushed her. That day, Rocky drove us back. I sat next to Serena, leaning on her, and finally started to cry, realizing things only then. Rocky, ever considerate, didn't look back. Serena gently patted me, and all we could hear was the wind whooshing past the car windows. The third time I saw Rocky was 2 days later. The police called me, asking me to come by and pick someone up. "Huh, Rocky, your boyfriend." When I walked into the police station with Serena supporting me, I felt the surrounding officers casting odd looks at me. The atmosphere was so strange it could have been fatal for someone with social anxiety. "Why are they looking at me like this?" I whispered to Serena. "I'm so embarrassed." Serena smirked and loudly said, "They're interested in you." The officer cleared his throat, choosing to ignore Serena's silly comment. He gestured for us to sit down, looking troubled. "Who is this?" I extended my hand to shake the officers, introduced myself, and clarified Serena's identity. I then realized the officer speaking to me was not an uncle, but a younger guy. "Here's the thing," he paused. "Mr. Rocky assaulted Mr. Tony. How bad was it? Was he injured?" Serena was more excited than if she were watching a monster movie, her eyes shining brightly. "Not very serious," the officer scratched his head. "His face is bruised and swollen, with some soft tissue injuries." I was a bit confused. "So why call the police?" The officer's expression turned a mix of displeasure and frustration. "Mr. Tony claims you are in a relationship with him and that you're now cheating on him with Mr. Rocky, instructing him to." He struggled to find the right word. Serena interrupted. "Assault." "Oh," the officer nodded. "That's one way to put it. Anyway, I think this is a personal matter between you all. I'll bring them out, and you can sort it out yourselves. If you need further assistance, we'll get involved." He walked into a separate room and brought out 2 people, Rocky and Tony. Rocky was dressed in a gray hoodie and sweatpants. His bangs a bit disheveled over his forehead, exuding an effortless cool, very much in line with the vibe. In contrast to the tall Rocky, Tony was shorter and thinner, shrinking away to one side. His bruises made him look rather comical. Serena nudged me with her foot. "I think you must be blind to have broken up with my brother and ended up with Tony." Tony subtly moved away from Rocky, pointing at his bruises. "Look, Haley, this is all because of you. I smirked, brushing my bangs aside to reveal my still swollen and ugly scar. Tony, be a man. Are you really whining about a few bruises? And, I adjusted my bangs. How dare you claim I'm your girlfriend to the police and accuse me of cheating? What gives you the right to slander me? My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, drawing the attention of those around us. Yet, I felt no sense of shame. Tony was about to argue but was cut off by me. You keep saying I betrayed you, but it seems you're projecting. Maybe you're feeling guilty because you're the one in the wrong. Suddenly, Tony laughed. Haley, why are you so desperate for affection? You cling to anyone who shows you a bit of kindness. Is it because you grew up in a single-parent family? If I remember correctly, your last partner was also unfaithful, right? Isn't that true, Rocky? He emphasized the last part with a slightly mocking tone. Rocky, who had his hands in his pockets, immediately reached out, but I stopped him with a word. I gave a disdainful smile. What my family is like or what my ex did is none of your business. If you're so idle, are you going to stop every garbage truck near your home just to taste its contents? Tony, do you really think so highly of yourself? Rocky, standing to the side, kept his head slightly lowered, his expression unreadable as he seemed to be deep in thought, remaining silent. I had no desire to continue the argument with Tony, so I called Serena, and we left the police station. Serena, reading the situation, didn't invite Rocky to come along. She carefully supported me and we took a taxi home. Back at the house, I collapsed on the sofa and Serena sat next to me. After a few false starts, she couldn't help but ask, Haley, is what Tony said true? I laughed and flicked her on the forehead. What are you thinking? Is Rocky that kind of person? After resting at home for a few days, I got the doctor's permission to return to work. Just to clarify, the doctor isn't Rocky. Since returning home from the police station, we lost contact again, and Serena hasn't mentioned him either. We used to spend every day together and talked about everything, but now things have changed. We both tacitly acknowledged the awkwardness of our relationship. There's been so much that neither of us can sort out alone. Serena dashed into the dressing room, leaning close to my ear, hesitating a bit. Haley, guess who's here? I don't know. My brother, she said, biting her lip. If you don't want him here, I can send him away. I shook my head. Everyone who comes to the theater is a spectator. That would be too deliberate. Serena stuck out her tongue. All right. I smiled and patted Serena. Let's go out for milk tea. Tonight is my performance. I took a deep breath and walked onto the stage, standing in the spotlight. The audience was packed, a dense sea of black that once made me anxious, but now felt reassuring. I've been dancing since I was very young and always considered it a hobby. But then, during middle school, my grades dropped sharply, and my homeroom teacher suggested I pursue an art exam, so I ended up dancing for a lifetime. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's the truth. After the performance, I went backstage to celebrate with the girls from the dance troupe, but then I glanced up and saw Rocky quietly standing at the door. Rocky has a refined look, but his raised eyebrows and smirk add a hint of rebelliousness. At this moment, the warm orange light softened his edgy demeanor, making him look gentler. He held a large bouquet of red roses, which clashed sharply with his black suit. These unrelated things and people were unexpectedly linked. Rocky seemed to notice my gaze and looked up, meeting my eyes with a fiery and intense look. The girls nearby teased me, saying that my current partner was much better looking than the previous one. I smiled and told them I wouldn't be joining them for the traditional dinner tonight, which caused a stir. Finally managing to escape the crowd, I took Rocky to a quiet corner. Why are you here? He blushed slightly. I came to see you dance. You were amazing. He said this while offering me the bouquet, presenting it like a treasure, as if expecting my excitement and praise. On this cold winter night, we stood under the streetlight. My hands were in my pockets, and I didn't reach out for the flowers. With a dull thud, the bouquet fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. The once lush flowers lay on the ground like crumpled red paper. My voice trembled slightly. Rocky, you know very well what our relationship is like. I don't want you to make gestures before everything is clear. I won't be touched. On the contrary, I dislike this vague ambiguity. Rocky was stunned, clearly taken aback by my reaction. Snowflakes fell gently, swirling in front of my eyes and quickly melting into water on the ground, leaving tiny black dots. I looked down at the snowflakes dancing and smiled, then spoke. Others say that someone who made your heart race once will make it race again, but who can guarantee that past mistakes won't be repeated? I've always lacked a sense of security, but Rocky is quite the opposite. He's laid back, sometimes almost heartless, never interfering with others, but also unwilling to be controlled. When I message him, he doesn't reply immediately. When I invite him out, he always has something to do. Even on weekends, he only plays games with his buddies. He's studying medicine while I'm a dancer. He's busier, and I often go to his school to see him. When he sees me, he's less excited than his noisy friends and naturally pulls me along to eat with them. During meals, he always chats and laughs with his classmates, not noticing when I step out. I've tried hinting, crying, and even breaking up to get him to pay more attention to me. Each time, he'd apologize and buy me gifts as atonement, but he'd quickly forget. I've vented to friends who reassured me that boys are like this, and it'll get better. I should focus on his good and lovable traits. But during our senior year, Rocky went abroad with his classmates for study, and we became long distance. The 13-hour time difference often meant we barely spoke each day. I clearly remember that night when I was in pain and tearfully called Rocky, only to have Alice answer. Ironically, Alice, Rocky, and I were high school classmates, and Alice had liked Rocky since high school. She was smart, attractive, and kind, a goddess to many boys back then. In retrospect, maybe Rocky's carefree nature didn't let her succeed quickly, giving me a chance as his desk mate. Yes, being with Rocky always made me insecure and deeply doubtful. When I heard Alice's voice, my mind went blank. She told me Rocky was busy and that she'd have him call me back later. Her tone was affectionate and light, as if I was an outsider and they were the loving couple. I remember not saying a word, just hanging up immediately. An hour later, Rocky called me back. I've seen many romance movies where the leads either cry loudly or part in silence, but I wasn't like that. I was lying in bed. After answering the call, I paused for a few seconds and calmly said I wanted to break up. Rocky was still talking, asking if I had eaten and how I was doing. After I said this, he was silent for a moment and then continued talking as if nothing had happened. Rocky, I called his name, signaling him to stop. I said we should break up. Rocky was quiet for a long time, then asked why. My voice had a slight nasal tone, but I tried to hide it. We're not compatible. Do you think? He seemed to choose his words carefully. We could improve? That's his usual style, solving problems, always thinking about solutions without considering others' feelings. Out of his sight, I shook my head and said with a bitter smile, I don't think so. My tone was serious, lacking the usual teasing. He must have sensed it. After a long silence, he simply wished me well and said, goodbye. After hanging up, I lay in bed with a blank stare, listening to the horns outside. My roommates had already gone to bed, and I could only cry silently, unable to stop a few sobs. Later, Rocky found out that Alice had taken his phone and answered it without his permission. She and 2 classmates came to explain it to me in person. I listened, smiled at his shocked expression, thanked him, made a bit of small talk, and then left. Rocky must have thought I was angry about Alice and suspected his fidelity, but my decision had nothing to do with Alice. I had been with Rocky for 6 years. I trusted his character and knew his personality well. Even if he didn't explain, I wouldn't believe he'd cheat. I realized after much thought that the real reason for our breakup was our completely different circles. I wanted so much to be part of his life, but he never brought me into his world. One person wanted it, one person didn't. One lacked security, one didn't care about it. One had strong control needs, one didn't want to be bound. One was driven by emotions, one was shockingly rational. Our differences showed in every aspect, in every detail. Too many differences made the distance between us grow, and one person's efforts couldn't bridge this gap. Rocky was raised by his grandparents. They could only provide for his basic needs, so he became independent early, used to controlling his own life. After my father's infidelity, I lived with my mother. She could give me a lot, but couldn't fill the emotional void, so I depended on others and lacked security. Our lives started from different points, and that's fated and unchangeable. We were attracted to each other's strengths, but after the initial excitement wore off, all that remained were our incompatible personalities. Rocky lowered his head, a look of melancholy on his face, and sighed. Haley, I've thought a lot since we broke up. During those years, I didn't care for you as much as you cared for me, and I hurt you without realizing it. He looked up at me, his eyes shimmering with tears. Haley, I regretted it then, but when I returned, I found out you were almost with Tony. Now I hope you'll give me another chance. This time, let me chase you. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, thinking about the past. Rocky was handsome, had excellent grades, and was also good at basketball, serving as the captain of the school team. At the time, many girls gossiped behind my back, saying that Rocky was so kind to me and sat with me because I was seducing him. Yes, they actually used the word seducing. When I heard this, I sat alone in the classroom during a break, wiping away tears. And Rocky saw me when he returned from playing basketball. He came back to get his water bottle, took a few steps out, then stopped and returned to my side. Why are you crying? Rocky lowered his head, our noses almost touching, and I could see the faint beauty mark near his eye. The sunlight was bright outside, casting a warm glow on his youthful face, outlining his delicate features. The faint fragrance from his hair made me feel inexplicably less sad, and I told him about everything through my sobs. He frowned slightly, visibly unhappy. Don't pay attention to those people. They're not worth it. After saying that, he hurried away, leaving only his retreating back. At that moment, I couldn't help but feel disappointed. How I wished he would sit down and keep me company, listen to my complaints, and say something comforting. But unexpectedly, within minutes, the girls who had upset me returned with sad faces, followed by Rocky's good friend. He came running in with excitement, sitting in Rocky's seat, openly thrilled. "Haley, those girls just got scolded by Rocky." It was so satisfying to hear. He mimicked Rocky's expression with disdain, acting it out in the air. Time has passed, but I still remember his words. "What's wrong with Haley? Huh, she's perfect. Who are you to gossip behind her back?" Thinking of that moment now, I can't help but smile at the memory of his sharp tongue and arrogance. The next morning, I went to the hospital for a follow-up check on my forehead injury, only to run into Rocky. Seeing me, he eagerly approached and invited me to lunch at the hospital cafeteria. Rocky was dressed in a white lab coat and wore a rare pair of gold-framed glasses, looking like a refined scoundrel. But this refined scoundrel was now wagging his tail cautiously, making me reluctant to refuse. A colleague approached and smiled when she saw me. "Oh, isn't this our sister-in-law?" I immediately looked up at Rocky, noticing his ears turning red. But he looked straight ahead and said seriously, "Not sister-in-law, she's my romantic interest." Is this something Rocky would say? I was nearly shocked, but Rocky's face remained stern, showing no hint of a joke. The colleagues laughed and cheered, escorting us into the cafeteria as if we were going to a wedding night. Rocky followed closely behind me, pointing out what was good and what wasn't while I served myself food. He remembered my preferences clearly, just like before, making my nose inexplicably feel a little sore. Rocky put a dish of pearl balls in my bowl, muttering, "You've always liked this." "I have another performance next week," I teased. "You're going to make me fat." He gave a goofy smile. "A little bit of weight won't show." When we finally sat down with his colleagues, chatting and eating, the atmosphere was friendly. Alice appeared out of nowhere, smiling. "Why didn't you wait for me today? It took me a while to find you." She suddenly stopped, making eye contact with me, her expression briefly showing a loss of control. Alice was tall and aloof. When she didn't smile, her mouth would turn down slightly, but her eyes were slightly upturned. Now she looked at me with a cold face, scanning me up and down, making me uncomfortable. I didn't put down my chopsticks and looked up at her with a smile. "Alice, it's been years since we last met." Rocky's former classmates were present and knew the whole story. They were surprised to see me greeting Alice and looked up at us in astonishment. Alice nodded and sat down, smoothing her skirt, taking the seat directly across from Rocky. She rested her chin on her hand and smiled at Rocky. "So, are you nostalgic for high school days? You didn't seem this sentimental when you were with me every day." Rocky glanced at her, then hurriedly turned to me, squeezing my hand under the table, his entire demeanor showing his anxiety. "Actually, I am nostalgic." She took a sip of water, narrowing her eyes with a faint smile. "A few days ago, our old teacher contacted me, wanting us to return and share our experiences with the current students. When are you available?" The table fell silent, everyone lowering their heads pretending to eat. I felt a pang of discomfort and sipped my soup, trying to seem unaffected. "I'm not available," Rocky replied firmly. "Really? Do you have an appointment?" Alice teased. "Not going to tell me?" "Rocky is going on a trip with Haley," an old classmate interjected. "He keeps asking me where's good." Rocky seemed to have been invigorated, straightening up with no hint of embarrassment, saying, "I didn't know if Haley would agree, so I didn't mention it. Why should I report my plans to you?" Alice was momentarily stunned, but quickly smiled and changed the topic. I glanced back in surprise, meeting Rocky's probing gaze. During college, I would eat with Rocky and his friends. They would jokingly pick out meat from their plates and compete to identify what they had chosen. Many terms related to muscles were unfamiliar to me, and I couldn't join the conversation. But Rocky was full of energy, blending into the lively and noisy group. I would quietly stir my rice, listening to their jokes, feeling as if I were sitting alone in a vast, empty playground, feeling anxious yet helpless. But now, I suddenly felt an unprecedented sense of reassurance. See, girls are such peculiar beings. Even a small detail can make them feel touched. Rocky quickly finished his meal, stood up to return his tray, then came back and whispered in my ear, "I'm going out to get you a drink." When we finished eating, we saw Rocky returning with a cup of fruit tea. He was casually swinging it, just like before. He saw me and quickly walked over, placing the tea in my hand, same as usual, 3-fingered sugar, hot. I put the straw in and looked at him, smiling. "Your memory is impressive." He scratched his head, looking a bit embarrassed, but clearly proud, of course. Nearby, people were gossiping, and Rocky joked with them to be quiet, but I noticed Alice looking dismissively. Rocky sent me a message inviting me out for dinner, and Serena cheered for her brother loudly. I thought about it and, without bothering to put on makeup, went downstairs to meet him. Rocky was engrossed in his phone when I arrived. Seeing me, he invited me to check it out with him and asked what I felt like eating. He was focused on his phone screen, his long lashes casting shadows on his face. His stubble was cleanly shaved, and he looked refreshingly youthful. There was a time when he wanted to be a tough guy, inspired by Fast and Furious. I glanced at his awkward stubble and laughed. Can we skip the fancy stuff? He looked like a pitiful little puppy. You don't like it? I nodded, and since then, I hadn't seen him with stubble again. Rocky was mumbling to himself, comparing things. When he noticed I was silent, he looked up, blushing immediately when he saw me, and avoided eye contact. Why are you blushing? I teased, so easily shy. Before I could finish, Rocky leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on my forehead. His faint grassy scent filled my senses, and the brief, delicate kiss left me flustered. I looked up at him, my face already red. Rocky grinned carefreely, hooking his pinky with mine and gently swaying it. It was getting dark, and the street lamps in the neighborhood started to glow, giving the deserted path a romantic atmosphere. The lights from the apartment buildings flickered, and the aroma of food wafted out from open windows, forming a lazy white mist. In the future, I'll cook for you. My cooking skills are incredible now, Rocky said with a smile. I didn't give him a chance to say, in the future, and immediately invited him upstairs to cook. When Serena heard the knocking, she shouted to leave it outside, then suddenly realized it was my voice and hurried to open the door. Hey, bro, Serena exclaimed exaggeratedly, you've done well. Come in, Rocky pushed Serena inside, you talk the most. Serena looked at Rocky with incredulous eyes, then turned her gaze back to me, rushing over to grab my arm. Haley, you've forgiven my brother so quickly? I took off my boots and winked at her. Not yet, still in the probation period. Rocky put on an apron and went into the kitchen, shooing Serena out who wanted to help. I leaned against the door frame, watching Rocky busying himself, and suddenly tears blurred my vision. I vaguely remembered my parents like this when I was little, but then Mom discovered Dad's affair, and the family fell apart. In my memories, Mom rarely smiled, her thin lips always pressed, making it hard to discern her feelings. During high school, when I went out with friends, Mom would call me repeatedly from the cinema. I turned off my phone. That night when I got home, Mom yelled at me fiercely, asking why I didn't answer her calls, and if I thought I had grown up and no longer needed her. Her expression was fierce, and her hair was disheveled like a shrew. But what I didn't expect was that many years later, I had unconsciously become the person I once despised. The current scene seemed to open a valve, causing memories of the past to flood my mind like a deluge, awakening my longing for home. Rocky was focused on the pot, the sizzling sound masking my sobs. The range hood light created a halo around Rocky's head. He turned around and asked if the color of the ribs looked good, only to find me crying. He immediately turned off the heat and rushed over. He intended to hug me, but his hand hovered in midair, unsure. He was always so considerate. Seeing his awkwardness made me smile through my tears. I wiped my nose and Rocky couldn't help but chuckle. I stepped forward and hugged him, burying my face in his chest. He gently cradled my head, whispering, "What's wrong?" I said nothing, just that I missed home. He was silent for a long time before finally saying, "Then let's get married, okay?" The next day, Rocky took a leave, and we went to get our marriage certificate. While waiting in line, Rocky kept complaining about the lack of flowers, rings, and ceremonies, displaying his typical straight guy traits. He turned to me and said, "Haley, should we go back and do a proper ceremony before getting the certificate?" I laughed and gave him a gentle tap, only you would make a fuss about it. After getting the certificate and returning to the car, Serena was still in shock. She looked at the two certificates, then at Rocky, then back at me. Suddenly, she leaped from the back seat, hugging me from the passenger seat and shouting, "My dear sister-in-law, from now on, I'm sticking with you." I took the marriage certificate and suddenly felt anxious. I looked up at Rocky and asked, "Did you tell Uncle and Auntie?" Serena burst into laughter. "Of course, we told them long ago." It turned out that after our breakup 4 years ago, during New Year's Eve, Rocky had gotten drunk and cried at the dinner table. Not only did his parents know, but the whole table of relatives knew. I put my hand to my forehead. What did he say? Ignoring Rocky's warning glare in the rearview mirror, Serena grinned and mimicked the crying sound, saying with slurred speech, "Mom, it's all my fault. I lost Haley. She might be crying somewhere secretly." Everyone at the table thought Rocky was saying I was crying for him, but I understood his true meaning because I had never returned home after turning 18. When I was 18, my first major argument with Mom was over my choice of college. She wanted me to fill out applications for local universities, but I refused. I cried, "Mom, I want to go to the arts university. Why won't you let me?" "Because I'm your mother," she roared, furious. "Why?" I screamed. "Why should I always listen to you? This is my life. I don't want you to control me." Her face was one of disbelief, and she slapped me hard, repeating the words she had said countless times. "What? You think you've grown wings and don't need me anymore? Haley, I'll control you without reason. I remember that day my face was cut by her wedding ring, which she had worn for over 10 years and refused to take off. It was so ridiculous. You're a control freak, I shouted, with a courage I didn't know I had, echoing what I had heard from my grandparents. The way you controlled Dad, he couldn't stand it and had an affair. It's all your fault. She suddenly cried, then stormed into my room, throwing all my things on the floor, creating a mess. Clothes, books, stationery, gifts from others were scattered, many items broken. Dad had once given me a wind chime when they first divorced, shaped like a kitten. When he gave it to me, his eyes were red as he apologized and said he was sorry. It was the last gift I received from Dad because Mom cut off all contact with him, and any gifts he sent were secretly thrown away by her. Once, I secretly opened one of these gifts, which was a set of Barbie dolls and a letter. I loved it dearly and hid it under my desk. The next day, when I came home from school, Mom saw me and pushed the box from the shoe cabinet, dropping it next to my feet. The colorful Barbie clothes spilled out like a burst paint can. She pointed at the mess on the floor and said firmly that I was never to accept gifts from Dad again. I retorted, asking about her ring. She slapped me again and stomped on the Barbie dolls. I clearly heard the plastic crunching under her foot. So when I saw the broken wind chime that day, I went mad, storming out of the house. Mom screamed after me, saying if I left, I would no longer have her as a mother. I hesitated, then slammed the door behind me. That night, when I went to Rocky, he was playing games. When he saw my tear-streaked face, he immediately put down the game console and comforted me. He took me to the small hill behind his house to look at the stars, pointing out constellations. I didn't listen to any of it. Seeing my silence, Rocky also fell silent. After a long while, I asked him if I was wrong. He simply wrapped his arm around my shoulders and said nothing. Later, he took me to my grandparents' house. After we said goodbye and I was about to go inside, he called me back. Standing straight under the silvery moonlight, he said seriously, Haley, I'll always be with you. After starting college, I worked part-time and cut off contact with Mom. I didn't return home for the new year, and it continued like that once I started working. I knew I was at fault and understood Dad was unforgivable, but I couldn't bridge the enormous gap between me and Mom over the years. I still didn't know how to face her or repair the broken bond between us. After getting married, Rocky seemed to have changed completely. He wanted to tell me everything, even down to the taste of the lunch in the hospital cafeteria. I found it quite amusing because his messages were all trivial. Serena clicked her tongue beside me. How did I never know my brother was so clingy? He used to keep a straight face and hardly said a word to anyone. As she spoke, he sent another message. Haley, are you there? Why aren't you replying? Pitiful. Serena covered her eyes. Oh my God, is this really Rocky? I never want to see him again. I laughed and gave her a light tap on the head. In a few days, when I move out, you probably won't have to see him every day. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I applied for a transfer to Washington so that Rocky and I can be together. That evening, I went to pick up Rocky from work. I wanted to surprise him, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I ran into Alice. She wasn't wearing any makeup, and her shoulder-length straight hair was casually tied with a black rubber band, yet she still looked striking. Do you have some time? Alice saw me stop and said, come to my office for a bit. I need to talk to you. She must have just come out of surgery, and she looked very tired, not saying a word the entire way. Once we got to the office, she turned on the light, took out 2 cups, and made some tea. She nodded towards a seat. Just pick any place to sit. She then sat down heavily in a chair and sighed deeply. My relationship with Alice had always been quite delicate. During the time Rocky and I were separated, it was tense. I didn't understand why she would want to talk to me. You and Rocky are married now, right? Alice began, with a faint smile on her lips. Congratulations. She took a sip of her tea. Actually, Rocky and I are childhood friends. Our parents were college classmates, but not very close. We only saw each other a few times a year. Later, I realized I had developed feelings for Rocky. In high school, when I found out we were in the same class, I was genuinely happy. Seeing him every day was the best part of my day. But you know me. Alice paused. I'm too proud and reserved, never telling him how I felt, thinking I could make him like me. But then you ended up with him. Looking at her, I didn't sense the old hostility, and my heart softened. You think I'm not as good as you? She looked at me stubbornly. But Rocky likes you. He has always liked you. Even though he's been so carefree all his life, he really cares about you. I put in a lot of effort, but in the end, I realized. She gave a bitter smile. It was all unrequited. I didn't want to hear more. I knew it was cruel and impolite, but I still stood up, said I was sorry, and tried to leave. Haley, she called after me. I'm sorry. I wish you both happiness. I stopped, turned around, and smiled at Alice, whose eyes were shimmering with tears. Thank you. After leaving Alice's office, I went to find Rocky. He was in a white lab coat, packing up and preparing to leave work. When he saw me, he immediately put down what he was holding and walked over quickly. Wife, why are you here? Hearing him call me wife in such an endearing way was almost overwhelming. I pushed him away playfully. Be normal. He straightened up with a look of disappointment, but I patted him. Look down. I have a little gift for you. He lowered his head, and I gave him a kiss on the forehead, laughing heartily at his blushing face. We initially planned to visit our hometown and see our parents. But Rocky's parents said, Haley, it's not like we've never seen each other before. What's the point of making a fuss to come back? Take her out to play during the holiday, and then we'll see you when you come back. Rocky laughed. What about you guys? What's your plan? We'll go out with your sister. Don't you miss me? Rocky joked, as if testing. Who misses you, you little rascal? Auntie said with a smile, pretending to be annoyed. A flicker of disappointment crossed Rocky's face, fleeting but noticeable to me. I stood up, hugged Rocky from behind, and rested my forehead on his back. What's wrong? He sighed, staring at the dim screen, lost in thought. Haley, he said softly, do you think, am I too sentimental? Actually, what I wanted earlier was just to hear her say she missed me. I let go, walked around to face him, and gently cupped his face. Of course not. Who doesn't want to be cherished by someone? He smiled slightly, his eyes filled with affection, and wrapped his arms around my waist. When I was young, I lived with my grandparents. The old couple had poor hearing and didn't talk much. Whenever I called my parents, they barely had time to speak before they had to get back to work. He shrugged, his eyes reddening, which made me not very good at caring for others. I was about to comfort Rocky, but was interrupted by him. Haley, after we separated, I thought a lot and realized how much of an idiot I was. I swear I'll never be like that again. During the holidays, we took a trip to Switzerland. On the Alps, he knelt on one knee and proposed to me, the diamond sparkling in the magnificent sunset, casting a mesmerizing glow. Haley, he looked at me, speaking very seriously. Will you marry me? His eyes reflected the sunset, but it was not just the sunset, it was also me. I was teary-eyed. What's this sudden act? We already have our marriage certificate and you're proposing? He didn't smile, saying earnestly, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Shouldn't it be done completely? He tilted his head and thought for a moment. You said that girls pay a lot of attention to ceremonies. Behind him were towering snow-capped mountains, endless white snowfields, lush pine forests, and a vast orange sky. And in my eyes, there was only him. Our wedding was attended only by close family from both sides, small in scale, but full of thoughtfulness. I sent invitations to my parents. Dad cried on the phone, while Mom only replied with a soft acknowledgement. On the wedding day, Mom arrived even earlier than Dad. She walked over and handed me a card, advising me to not be capricious after marriage and to always think about the family, to manage the family well. Then she turned and walked to her seat. Mom, I suddenly started crying and ran to her. She looked surprised and, like me, had tears streaming down her face. From the age of 18 to now, 28, this was our first meeting in 10 years and our first hug in 22 years. She touched my face, choked up, and said, Haley, why are you crying? Marriage should be joyful. I was wrong in the past. I was really unfair. Please forgive me. I was overcome with emotion because she had finally removed her ring, letting go of a lifetime of grudges. Dad stood far off, his figure slightly hunched, while Rocky talked to him, making him smile through his tears. The sun hung high in the sky, bright and cheerful. Rocky and I stood side by side, listening to the emotional speech by our high school teacher. I looked up, meeting Rocky's gaze, seeing him smile faintly. I suddenly remembered how Rocky used to lazily lean by the window, giving me a slight smile. The sun streamed through the leaves, casting dappled light on him, outlining the carefree elegance of his youth. 12 years of twists and turns, separations and reunions, and in the end, fortunately, it was still you.